Hey guys, I'm going to be doing a cultural and theological assessment of the book The Hunger Games by Susan Collins. We're going to look into the world behind the book, the world of the book, the world in front of the book, and ultimately we're going to do a theological evaluation about how we respond to the world and the messages that the Hunger Games book is communicating to us. So there's three main themes that I pulled out of the book. I'm sure there's many, many more, but there were three main ones that stood out to me. It's the themes of justice, secondly, the themes of entertainment and violence being paired together, and third, the theme of power. And we'll begin to look in those things here shortly. But first, we're going to look into the world behind the text. So what led up to the Hunger Games book being written and created by Susan Collins? I found it really interesting as you studied her life and upbringing. I think that actually influenced her worldview and how she saw things. So, which ultimately influenced her as a writer and the writings that she creates, like the Hunger Games. So, Susan Collins, her dad was actually in the Air Force, fought in Vietnam, so she was exposed to the reality and the brutality of war from like a very young age. She even talked about seeing like a lot of images on TV when they would show clips of Vietnam, knowing that her dad was there and how it really messed with her, just seeing the violence and the brutality of it. And that even influenced like the books that she enjoyed reading as a child. Two of her favorite books were 1984 and Lord of the Flies. 1984 is a book about like an overbearing government and government surveillance. It's really about like corruption with power, and Lord of the Flies is about a group of young boys who were on a plane that crashed on an island. All the adults died, and they have to try to figure out how to lead and like how to build society. And there's a lot of strife and division that comes with the power and authority. So it's interesting when you hear that about her childhood, the books she was drawn to, and how that influenced how she saw things. You definitely see those things come out within the world of the Hunger Games that we'll begin to evaluate here shortly. And even her inspiration for the idea for the Hunger Games, she said that she was watching TV one evening, going back between reality TV and footage from the Iraq War, and she found herself going back between the two and came to the conclusion that most people don't know the difference between reality and like the reality TV and like entertainment, and then like the reality of like violence that consists within war. And it's interesting that thought that she said in an interview that I read, because like you see that entertainment and violence coming out within the world that the Hunger Games is communicating. So we're going to evaluate the world of the text. So what that means is like what is the Hunger Games communicating about like the world of the Hunger Games, and those involve things like justice, entertainment, and violence and power, and we're going to walk through all three of those. So the world of the text and the world that the Hunger Games shows is a world that's lacking justice and is in great need of justice. You can see that in how the tributes that are chosen, or the attributes that are chosen from the reaping from all the districts are like forced to compete within the Hunger Games, so they don't really like appear to not have any rights. They don't seem to have much like personal value. That they're just like people to be used by the capital for entertainment. So there's this world that's lacking justice. You can see even like the capital has all this food, all this wealth, and all these possessions, and the average person in the 12 districts like barely even has enough food to put on the table. So there's this huge separation between different levels of society and wealth and poor. So there's a lack of justice there. And that's really the world that the Hunger Games is portraying. It's a world that does not have justice, but a world that needs justice. Secondly, the world of the Hunger Games is communicating a world of entertainment and violence. And what I mean by that is it's like the citizens of the capital are entertained by the violence and the humiliation that happens to all these people that are competing in the Hunger Games. And You can even see that through like the celebration at the beginning when all the tributes come into the city. You can see that just by the citizens that are constantly tuning into the games to figure out who died, who survived. You can even see this entertainment through violence thing and how citizens can actually sponsor their favorite tribute to give them gifts during the actual Hunger Games to hopefully give them some type of advantage. So that there's this world where people are like numb to violence and they're actually entertained by the humiliation of other people, which is extremely messed up. And I think the Hunger Games is communicating that that's not good, that's actually very bad. And the third theme, I feel like the world of the Hunger Games is communicating a world where people with power are corrupt and people with power can't be trusted and people with power are only looking out for themselves. And you clearly see that through everything that the Capitol is, from forcing people to compete in the Hunger Games to even like physically and not geographically separating themselves from the other districts. The Hunger Games is communicating that those with power are corrupt, those with power cannot be trusted, those with power are only focused on themselves. So moving on to the world in front of the text, I feel like the specific book, The Hunger Games, the first book of the trilogy, connected with a lot of young adults and a lot of adults. But I think specifically, I think it connected with teens, and it influenced teens and like a drew teenagers in, because this book is all about self-expression. It's about individuality. It's about rebellion against authority, which like all of us were teenagers at one point, and the reality is we rebelled. We didn't want people telling us what to do, so they're just like questioning authority. Teenagers are all about like self-discovery of who they are, who they want to be, and like what they're all about. And I feel like that's why it drew so many young teens into reading these books and even seeing the films that were created off of the books, which was like a whole new thing of cultural artifacts that were created because of this first book that was written. You had the remaining two books of the trilogy, and then all the movies, and 26 million copies of the trilogy were sold. The movies got incredibly high reviews and a lot of awards. So there was a lot of acceptance of what the Hunger Games was communicating to society, and a lot of people connected with it. So moving on, we're going to do a theological evaluation or assessment of the world of the Hunger Games. So we're really asking the question of how does the world that the Hunger Games is presenting, how does that connect to the biblical framework, our Christian worldview, and like how do we respond to it? So we're going to be looking at the three themes again of justice, entertainment and violence, and power. So I feel like the world that the Hunger Games communicates about like a world that is lacking justice and in need of justice, I think fits into the biblical framework. Jesus calls us as his disciples to live obediently and to bring justice into the world. Proverbs 21:15, it says, when justice is done, it brings joy to the righteous, but it brings terror to evildoers. So there's this reality of if the world is a place of injustice, Jesus is calling us to somehow bring justice into it. But one thing that's different, I think, about how we respond is in the Hunger Games, you see a lot of like violence connected to justice. Like if I'm going to bring justice into the world, the only response that I can have is violence. And Jesus doesn't call us to that. He calls us to a life of servanthood and humility, and to know that ultimate justice is going to be served when he judges at the end of the age, and that it's our responsibility to wait for him to do that. So we as Christians should fight for justice through servanthood, through humility. We should never turn to violence. Isaiah 30 verse 18 says, the Lord longs to be gracious, therefore he will rise up to show you compassion, for the Lord is a God of justice. Blessed are all who wait for him. Secondly, entertainment and violence. I feel like the Hunger Games fits into the biblical framework because it's acknowledging the reality of a sin and evil in the world that shouldn't be there. It's acknowledging the reality of we shouldn't be entertained by the humiliation of other people, and we shouldn't be deceived by by sin. Genesis 4 verse 7, it says, "If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door, desires to have you, but you must rule over it." So there's this reality of, like, sin is deceitful. We as believers need to be aware of its deceitful ways, and we should never be entertained by the humiliation or suffering of other people, but we should fight for them above all, and that any evil action toward any person or any group of people is wrong. So I feel like that's all our response to the world of entertainment and violence that the Hunger Games is communicating, that it's clearly communicating it's wrong, that there's a reality of sin and evil, and that's something that we experience in our day and time too, and it's just a matter of how do we react to it, and making sure that we're honoring people and that we aren't watching things or taking place with things that's devaluing other people just for our own personal benefit. And third, with power, the world of the Hunger Games portrays a world that's full of corrupt power, and I feel like this ties into the biblical framework in our Christian worldview because, again, it's acknowledging the reality of sin and evil within the world, and that when people in power aren't submitted to the lordship of Christ and they're only thinking about themselves, that bad things happen. I believe that Matthew 20:25 through 28, it says that Jesus called them together and says, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them, but not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to serve, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." So, like, biblically, true power is found in servanthood. True power is found in putting others before ourselves. It's not about a position that I have. But ultimately, we know that the Bible says that God puts people in power and that he's sovereign over that. So we as Christians need to trust and know that whoever is in positions of power within our country, we're called to pray for them. We're called to submit to them. That God has given authority to the state in hopes that they will use that power correctly. But ultimately, we must know that no human being is perfect, that there's going to be corruption in all parts of our society, especially with those with power. And we have to remind ourselves as Christians that no human being is greater than the Lord, that God's sovereign over all. And that he's the one that we have to submit to, and that ultimately the Lord is our ultimate authority. He's our ultimate king, and one day all will be made right in his kingdom. So that's my cultural assessment and theological evaluation of the book The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins.